There's something about the village of Mells on the northern flank of the Mendip Hills in Somerset. It's a quiet place, but it whispers its colossal stories to you. You sense it before you even really know it, as you're ushered from the meadows into the churchyard by a guard of yew trees. You begin to hear the laughter that would have once filled the lush lawns of the nearby manor house, to hear the frenzy of activity as this great church was once constructed. Buttress pinnacles rising up to more pinnacles above and announcing its glorious elegance over the surrounding countryside. There are so many stories to tell from this particular plot of England, yet today I want to share one story which stopped me in my tracks, which takes us back to a time which the historian Eric Hobsbawm described as the age of extremes, the age of total war, when the lamps went out across Europe and the entire edifice of European civilization crumpled in flames. That moment was standing here before the village war memorial. Nearly every village in the land has a war memorial. Few are quite like the one here at Mells. There's a central column rising to a sculpture of St. George slaying the dragon. The names of the war dead are either side. There's a rubble wall, these low benches on which wreaths are placed, and the familiar homely embrace of these yew trees. On the central Portland stone panel, the inscription, "We died in a strange land facing the dark cloud of war." And this stone is raised to us in the home of our delight. This war memorial was created by Lutyens, the same Lutyens who created the nation's most famous war memorial, the Cenotaph on Whitehall. He was friends with Frances Horner of Mells Park and Mells Manor. She nurtured his career, introduced him to many of the great politicians of the age, as well as her extensive network of artist friends. Indeed, Lutyens' works are dotted around the village. How extraordinary to have such pieces in the Somerset countryside. It doesn't stop there. These words are by the poet laureate Robert Bridges. The contrast is all there. These men, many of them mere boys, plucked from their ancient villages and thrust into the machinery of continental warfare. Colliery workers, gardeners, gamekeepers stand alongside the famous names of the village. Edward Horner, heir to the estates of Mells which stretch back 11 generations to the Reformation, and his brother-in-law, Raymond Asquith, son of the wartime Prime Minister, H.H. Asquith. And we can imagine that warm summer's day in 1921 when the war memorial was unveiled. Villagers gathered around servicemen and clergy, the familiar peal of church bells and a Union Jack flapping in the breeze. Before the fateful events of 1914, there'd been a century of relative stability in Europe. Only the Crimean War of 1854 to 1856, with Britain and France on one side and Russia on the other, had seen more than two of the great powers confront one another. But of course, the world of 1914 was so different to the world of 1814. Quite literally, the furnace of the Industrial Revolution had forged a new civilization. The ironworks in the valleys near Mells are testament to that history. Perhaps there'd never been so much hope for humanity at that time, but from a cloudless sky, the storm of an unimaginable war was gathering. We were very much in the political world. My dream had come true. Asquith, Haldane and Grey had more and more power in the state. I used to think that if Asquith were Prime Minister, Grey Foreign Secretary and Haldane Lord Chancellor, all would be well in the world. And so it was for a time, before the shattering years broke us. Frances Horner wrote these words in 1933, looking back on the war. Symbolically, the day that war was declared, there was a grand party at Mells. We can imagine the frivolous atmosphere, almost the excitement as political matters were discussed with little idea of the horror that was to come. Raymond Asquith was at that party. He wrote, "There was a hell of a crowd here this weekend. Soon the party would be over. The interior of St Andrews is dominated by this equestrian statue to Edward Horner. Here he rides proudly into battle, head held high, in the manner that his mother, Frances Horner, requested him to be cast by Sir Alfred Munnings. The plinth is by Lutyens. On one side is inscribed the words from Shelley's elegy on the death of Keats: "He hath outsoared the shadow of our night." Edward no doubt had great courage. In 1915, he was hit by a sniper and spent months recovering in England. However, all that time he was desperate to get back to the war. He felt like it was his calling, his purpose. And despite the best efforts of his mother to thwart those desires, he soon found himself back in Egypt and then in France. But he would be hit by a sniper again. Clearing a village, he watched the Germans fall back from the church which they'd been sheltering in. He called his men forward and he took the lead. And as he was giving instructions, he was shot. He would die that evening at the age of just 28 on the 21st of November, 1917. He was buried at a roadside grave just 2 weeks before he'd been taking leave in Mells. Edward was a well-loved character, but he certainly had his own vulnerabilities. He was mired in gambling debt by the time that the war started, and he certainly liked a drink. As one of his contemporaries was to write about his university days, and which could be taken as a wider critique for a generation of privileged children from the landed classes, he had no desire except to sip honey. Yet the war really did provide Edward with purpose. It aligned with the values of chivalry and pre-Raphaelite romance in which he was raised and which are reflected in this monument for posterity. This embroidery by Frances Horner demonstrates those pre-Raphaelite values, the bohemian world of London and beyond in which Frances was raised. It depicts Dante's vision of heaven, 8 children surrounding a resplendent mother, shimmering in sages, roses, sky blues, and with that stunning gold frame. The design was by Edward Burne-Jones, Frances's great friend and one of the preeminent artists of the age. In so many ways, it captures Frances's romanticism and the romanticism of the age, which she was to elaborate at Mells Manor and Mells Park before, in which she was to wrap around her social circle, all those great artists and the coming age of liberal politicians in the 1890s. But by the time of Edward's death, the internal world by which Frances orientated herself must have been turned upside down. Not only had she lost Edward, but this compounded the loss of her other son, Mark, in 1908, who died of scarlet fever, not yet in his adult years. And in 1917, Mells Park, the house which Frances had first moved to, just on the edge of Mells, a huge 40-bedroom pile, first built in the 18th century, burned down. In fact, Edward had returned to England a few weeks before his final days in France to be with the family in the aftermath of that tragedy. This was a time, as she was to describe them, of the shattering years when tragedy after tragedy just seemed to accumulate. Whilst Raymond was at that party at the very dawn of the Great War, besides his wife Catherine, daughter of Francis, he would have known then that he would probably have to play his role in the upcoming conflict. He was an incredible mind, the paragon, perhaps, of late Victorian virtue. Tall, handsome, the son of the Prime Minister, an intellectual blaze who went from a first in Greats at Oxford to be elected as a Fellow of All Souls College, also at Oxford. There are a lot of expectations placed on Raymond. This was a time when such men were expected to go on and enter the cabinet, run the empire. And although he was shy of those expectations, or a little bit too wise to gnaw on them too closely, he would have felt a sense of duty at this time to play his role, not only in the war, but also in the future of the nation. The sun broke out over the fields of the Somme after 10 days of rain as Lieutenant Raymond Asquith rode out on his horse to a crossroads at Fricourt. His brigadier had instructed him to rendezvous with the Prime Minister, his father, H. Asquith. Raymond waited at the crossroads and eventually 2 staff cars pulled up. He was reunited with his father, the Prime Minister, to the sound of barking guns in the distance. All was relatively quiet in that spot until a shell came whizzing by and exploded. One of the chauffeurs from the general headquarters actually ended up on his belly in the mud as they scrambled for a nearby dugout. But Raymond was to write to his wife, Catherine, that the PM was not discomposed by this experience. They talked for a brief period until the Prime Minister returned for lunch and Raymond returned to his billets. Under a crisp autumnal sky, this was to be the last time they would ever meet. Soon after, Raymond would lead his company over the top under intense shelling and machine gun fire. Almost immediately, he was hit in the chest. He knew the fatal nature of that wound, but to project a sense of calm to his men in one last courageous act, he lit a cigarette, pretended things would be okay, and awaited his stretcher. He would die very soon after. Raymond had been part of an epic battle for the Quadrilateral, a heavily fortified German fortress which eventually was to be taken. But he seemed resigned to his fate. There are letters between Raymond and Catherine, who was back in England. I have one of them here, written on 12th of September 1916. It would be not altogether disagreeable to come back and do something at the War Office during the winter months. I'm getting terribly tired of not being home and not seeing sweetest Faunia, the nickname he had for Catherine. But I must see out the fighting season. Tomorrow we shall move forward again, probably into the line. Angel, I send you all my love. Remember me to Trim, Trim being the nickname for their son, Julian. Raymond died on September the 15th, 1916. It wasn't until the 17th that the news reached home. At 9:45 p.m, Margot Asquith was called to the telephone at the Wharf, the country home in Oxfordshire where the Asquiths had been hosting a weekend gathering. The PM was relaying stories of his time with Raymond and gushing over the organisation of the British and French troops. His second secretary was on the line to Margot and relayed the news. He then rang Mells to reach Frances so she could break the news to her daughter. Back at the wharf, Asquith met his wife in the corridor. Upon seeing her face, he knew what had happened. It was from the failures of the Somme offensive that Asquith, by then 64, would never recover. Weeping at his desk, he had lost his eldest son. Soon he would lose the political authority of his government. Throwing himself back to his work, he increasingly began to display the personal and political toll of the war. The strain was near unbearable. With Allied troops faltering in the muds of France, so too did the destiny of the man who had occupied 10 Downing Street for nearly a decade. With British casualties rising, little territorial gain visible, the Somme had become the swamp, sucking men into its mire. By December 1916, Asquith had been replaced by Lord George, who had pushed a split in the Liberal Party and, with support from influential Conservatives and press barons, seized the initiative to form a new coalition government. Catherine had been inconsolable at the loss of her husband. It broke her despite Raymond promising her that if he were offered a job away from the front lines, that he would take it, he died in the thick muds of France with his men. He'd been too gallant. He knew the contempt that the elite were held by those suffering on the front lines, and he was resigned to his fate. He knew in some ways that that was his destiny, or at least that's the sense that I get through reading his words and assessing his character at this time. Mells meant so much to Raymond and, of course, to Catherine. This was where some of the most important scenes of their courtship took place. It's therefore appropriate that there is a memorial here to Raymond, quite literally cut into the stone of the church. There are 11 lines in Latin, a bronze wreath above, and here 2 little hooks for his sword, now held for safekeeping, but in some ways an attempt to rescue some triumph, some gallantry from that bloody, awful war. Despite the intensity of her grief, Catherine was able to find the inner strength to head to the front lines as a VAD nurse just a few years after the death of Raymond. Fortunately for us, she kept a diary of this time between April and August 1918. There is a melancholy tone to these diaries. We can hear a great intelligence writhing with passion and trauma. Just listen to this. These words were written on May the 20th, 1918. The moonlight was as clear as day, but in the southeast the sky was rose-coloured. A great ammunition dump had been fired near Ark, and the blaze was wonderfully lovely. The searchlight made long white beams across the clear sky, and the noise was simply terrific. It was the most exciting moment. The beauty of the sky and the noise and the horror far off combined to put an edge on the most trivial and familiar thoughts. There were a great many machine guns firing and bombs dropping, and every now and then a great explosion from the dump. It becomes clear when reading Catherine's diaries from 1918 that she felt an increasing connection with her deceased husband through her wartime duties. There is one remarkable entry from July the 20th, 1918. In this entry, she records an adventure she had at night where she actually dressed as a Tommy, the nickname for a British Army soldier, and was taken in a daring mission to the front lines and beyond into no man's land. She records these incredible words reflecting on that experience. It's the only positively happy thing that I've done for 2 years. Is it a betrayal of Raymond to have been happy for an hour or two? I think not, for the chief alarm lay in 2 facts: that I just might have been killed, and that I was seeing the sort of thing that he saw. I know that it is very false to see war as a romance, but it is a comfort that one can do it sometimes, and the loveliness of that moonlit field with guns all around it is a thing I shall never forget. We can think of Catherine lying in a field as she heard the gunshot all around her during the Great War, feeling a sense of closeness to Raymond. And in that, we feel a groping for meaning in all of this horror and all of this trauma. Despite being unsure whether Catherine wanted to go on living at all, in the emotional writing of her diaries, she went on to live till the grand age of 90. She converted to Catholicism and found great comfort in her faith. For me, looking back on the Great War, it's hard to understand how a nation could bear such trauma, how we could ever recover from that lost generation of men. Of course, we've talked extensively here about the stories of Edward and Raymond. There would have been many, many more men in Mells alone, never mind across the rest of the country, the empire, and indeed all of the countries involved in that terrible war which of course was to be repeated just a generation later. But as we look back now at villages like Mells, the stories from those times filter back to us. We can hear the words, the memories whisper to us to this day. And that is a profound and moving experience. I hope you've enjoyed this documentary. I certainly enjoyed making it. Mells is a truly special place, and I think anyone wishing to explore the history of the war should come to this part of the Somerset countryside to hear the profound story that emanates from this blessed plot. Lines of grey, muttering faces, masked with fear. They leave their trenches, going over the top, while time ticks blank and busy on their wrists. And hope, with furtive eyes and grappling fists, flounders in mud. Oh Jesus, make it stop.